The click of the front door latch was Caleb's daily cue. He'd look up from his work, a faint smile playing on his lips as he anticipated Mia's whirlwind entrance. But lately, the whirlwind had dwindled to a gentle breeze. Today was no different. Mia trudged in, her tiny backpack hanging limply from her. The digital clock glowed 3:17 a.m., a malevolent red, eye staring back at Caleb from the bedside table. Sleep, a fickle friend at the best of times, had abandoned him entirely. He tossed and turned, the sheets twisted around his legs like the anxieties coiling in his gut. Mia ese lunchbox. Empty. Again. The simple fact, so easily dismissed earlier, now gnawed at him, a persistent splinter in his mind. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just a picky eater. Maybe she was sharing with her friends. But a 3-year-old sharing her meticulously packed lunch every single day? The logic crumbled under the weight of his unease. He saw Mia's face, usually bright with the boundless energy of a child discovering the world, strangely subdued these past few days. Tired, quiet. The image clashed with the carefree spirit he knew, and the dissonance grated on him, sharpening the edges of his worry. He punched his pillow into a more comfortable shape, a futile attempt to find a position that might coax sleep. He closed his eyes, but Mia's face, small and pale, swam in the darkness behind his eyelids. He imagined her tiny hand reaching into her lunchbox, expecting the familiar crunch of a cracker, the juicy burst of a grape, only to find nothing. The thought was a physical blow, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. The insistent chirping of his alarm finally dragged Caleb from the restless depths of semi-consciousness. The red digits now mocked him with a far too cheerful 6 a.m. He felt as if he hadn't slept at all. The anxiety that had plagued him through the night hadn't dissipated, but had instead congealed into a hard knot of determination. He had to know. He had to understand why Mia's lunchbox kept returning empty. As he went through the motions of his morning routine, the automatic grind of the coffee beans, the lukewarm shower, the shave that felt too close to his skin, his mind raced, sifting through possibilities, discarding improbable scenarios, and clinging to the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He glanced at the small voice recorder he'd picked up on his way home from work yesterday. A small, innocuous device, yet in his hand, it felt heavy with the weight of potential revelation. He tucked it into his pocket, a secret weapon against an unknown enemy. Downstairs, Mia was already at the kitchen table, picking listlessly at her breakfast. The sunlight streaming through the window highlighted the shadows under her eyes, confirming his worries. He forced a smile, trying to project a normalcy he didn't feel. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. Mia looked up, her eyes meeting his with a fleeting flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Was it fear? Hesitation? He pushed the thought away. He was being paranoid, wasn't he? He sat down beside her, pouring himself a cup of the strong, black coffee he desperately needed. He watched her push the cereal around in her bowl, the colorful loops swirling in the milk like miniature life rafts adrift in a sea of her apathy. The sight twisted something inside him. He had to tread carefully. He had to coax the truth out of her without alarming her. So, he began casually, "What did you have for lunch yesterday, sweetheart?" He tried to keep his tone light, but he felt the tension radiating from him, a palpable force in the small kitchen. Mia hesitated, her lower lip trembling slightly. She looked down at her bowl, her small fingers tracing patterns in the condensation. The silence stretched, thin and taut, filled with unspoken words and half-formed fears. "Mia," he prompted gently, his heart clenching with each passing second. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Johnson, he ate it." The words hung in the air, fragile and accusatory. Caleb felt a surge of anger, hot and immediate, but he forced it down, reminding himself that he needed to remain calm, to get the whole story. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening around his coffee mug. "He ate your lunch?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. He saw her nod, a tiny movement of her head, almost imperceptible. "All of it," he pressed gently. Another hesitant nod. "But why? he asked, the question a plea for understanding in the swirling confusion of his thoughts. Mia shrugged, her small shoulders slumping. He says, I don't need it all. Her voice trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Caleb's stomach twisted. He said, you don't need all your lunch? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded again, the tears now spilling down her cheeks. I'm little, so I don't eat much, she mumbled, her voice thick with unshed tears. I did, but he said, big people need it more. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Big people need it more. The flimsy, absurd excuse echoed in his mind, fueling the anger that burned in his chest. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost choked him. He pulled Mia into his arms, holding her close, absorbing her small tremors against his chest. He smoothed her hair, murmuring soothing words, trying to comfort her while a storm raged inside him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't let this go. He needed proof. He needed something concrete to take to the principal, something that would force her to take action. The small voice recorder in his pocket suddenly felt heavy, not with the weight of potential, but with the weight of responsibility. He knew what he had to do. The kitchen hummed with the low thrum of the refrigerator, a constant, almost comforting presence in the otherwise silent pre-dawn. Caleb stood by the counter, the faint glow of the stovetop clock reflecting in his weary eyes. 3:17 nachts. He wasn't a man accustomed to such early risings, but something had shifted within him, a disquiet that chased sleep away. It felt like a cold knot tightening in his stomach, twisting with each passing day, each empty lunchbox. He picked up the small metallic device, turning it over and over in his hand. A voice recorder no bigger than his thumb. It felt strangely heavy, imbued with a significance that went beyond its physical weight. This tiny piece of technology, he hoped, held the key to unlocking the unsettling mystery surrounding Mia's disappearing lunches. He'd purchased it impulsively yesterday, driven by a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. The logical part of his mind still questioned his actions, whispering doubts about overreacting, about creating unnecessary drama. What if it was all a misunderstanding? What if Mia was simply eating everything, driven by a sudden, inexplicable growth spurt? But the image of his daughter's increasingly quiet demeanor, the subtle shadows under her eyes, chipped away at his rationalizations. He couldn't shake the feeling, the primal instinct of a parent sensing something amiss in their child's world. The recorder felt cool against his palm, a stark contrast to the growing warmth of anxiety spreading through his chest. He opened the cupboard, the familiar clinking of mugs and glasses momentarily breaking the silence. He selected Mia's favorite lunchbox, the one with the bright yellow sunflowers, the same one that returned home empty day after day. The sight of it sparked a fresh wave of unease, a mixture of anger and helplessness. He'd packed it with such care, choosing her favorite snacks, cutting her sandwiches into fun shapes, only to have it returned devoid of any sign of its contents. Where was it all going? The question gnawed at him, a relentless echo in the quiet of the kitchen. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands as he carefully positioned the recorder inside the lunchbox. He tucked it beneath a small, reusable ice pack, ensuring it was well hidden amongst the folds of the insulated lining. He tested the device several times, listening to the soft whirring sound that indicated it was recording. It was a small act, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet it felt momentous. It was a step into the unknown, a leap of faith into a situation that was slowly becoming more unsettling than he could have ever imagined. The first rays of dawn began to filter through the kitchen window, painting the room in a soft, ethereal light. He closed the lunchbox, the familiar click echoing in the stillness. It sounded different now, heavier, laden with a sense of purpose. Later that morning, as Mia sat at the kitchen table, happily munching on her breakfast cereal, Caleb approached her with a prepared lunchbox. He crouched down beside her, his gaze meeting hers. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, seemed a little duller than usual. He forced a smile, hoping to mask the turmoil within him. Tomorrow I'm going to pack your lunch like always, he began, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Mia looked up at him, a smear of milk on her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. But Daddy's going to put something special inside. It's a secret. He winked, hoping to inject a sense of playful intrigue into the situation. Mia's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of her usual curiosity returning. A secret, she repeated, her voice small. He nodded, his heart heavy with a mixture of apprehension and determination. He couldn't explain the true nature of the secret to his 3-year-old daughter. He couldn't burden her with the weight of his suspicions, the growing unease that was slowly consuming him. But he could protect her. He had to. He ruffled her hair, trying to project an air of normalcy. Just a little secret between you and me, okay? Mia nodded solemnly, her small face serious. Caleb felt a pang of guilt. He was involving her in this, albeit unknowingly. He was using her innocence as a tool to uncover a truth he desperately needed to know. But the alternative, the thought of continuing to send her into a situation where something was clearly wrong, was unbearable. He had to know. He stood up, the weight of the lunchbox, both literal and metaphorical, pressing down on him. As he placed it in the refrigerator, ready for the next day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a territory far more complex and disturbing than a few missing sandwiches. The humming of the refrigerator seemed to intensify, a low, persistent drone that mirrored the anxiety churning within him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever the next day would bring. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Caleb's living room. The dust motes dancing in the golden rays a stark contrast to the unease churning in his gut. Mia's lunchbox sat on the kitchen counter, a pastel pink unicorn grinning obliviously from its side. He stared at it, the innocent image a mockery of the suspicion that had taken root in his mind, twisting and growing like a noxious weed. He hadn't wanted to believe it, had tried to reason it away as a childish exaggeration, a misunderstanding. But the persistent emptiness of the lunchbox, coupled with Mia's unusual quietness, gnawed at him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. What if he was wrong? What if he was creating a problem where none existed? The thought pricked at him, a flicker of self-doubt. But then he remembered Mia's listless demeanor, the way she'd drag her feet on the walk home, the faint shadows under her eyes. He pushed down the latch, the click echoing in the sudden silence of the room. Inside, nestled amongst the crumbs and the faint scent of peanut butter, was the small digital recorder. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the smooth plastic casing. It felt strangely heavy, laden with the potential to confirm his worst fears or alleviate his growing anxiety. He walked to the study, the recorder clutched tight in his hand, a cold knot tightening in his chest. He sat at his desk, the familiar clutter of papers and pens a strange comfort in this unsettling moment. He connected the recorder to his laptop, the hum of the machine a low thrum in the quiet room. He clicked the play button, the silence stretching, taut with anticipation. A few seconds of static, then a familiar voice, Mr. Johnson's, filled the room. "All right, let's see what we've got today." The casual tone, the almost jovial inflection, grated on Caleb's nerves. He could picture him, the overly bright smile, the carefully gelled hair, the image now tainted with a layer of something ugly, something he couldn't quite name. "Peanut butter and jelly again," Mr. Johnson's voice continued, a note of feigned disappointment coloring his tone. Caleb's jaw clenched. He remembered making that sandwich, carefully cutting it into triangles, Mia's favorite shape. He'd even used the cookie cutters to make little star shapes out of the crusts. The recording continued. "You don't need all this, sweetheart." The endearment, so sickeningly sweet, made Caleb's stomach churn. He could feel his anger rising, a hot, burning sensation spreading through his chest. "Little girls don't eat much," the words hung in the air, a chilling testament to the casual cruelty of Mr. Johnson's actions. Caleb's breath hitched. He thought of Mia, her small hands, her tiny frame. How could anyone deny her the sustenance she needed? "I'll take this today," the blatant admission of guilt, the utter lack of remorse, sent a wave of nausea washing over Caleb. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. He wanted to shout, to scream, to lash out. "I'm hungry." The simple statement, so devoid of any justification, struck Caleb with its raw selfishness. He imagined Mia, sitting at the small table in her preschool classroom, watching her lunch disappear, her innocent trust betrayed. "Mia, I told you big people need it more," the final blow. The blatant lie, the manipulation of a 3-year-old, was more than Caleb could bear. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Caleb sat there, the words echoing in his mind, each syllable a hammer blow against his composure. He felt a strange detachment, as if he was watching the scene unfold from a distance. The anger was still there, a simmering rage beneath the surface, but it was overlaid with a profound sense of disbelief. How could this be happening? How could someone in a position of trust, someone responsible for the well-being of children, commit such a callous act? He closed his eyes, trying to process the information, trying to reconcile the image he had of Mr. Johnson with the reality revealed by the recording. He thought of Mia, her bright eyes, her infectious laughter. He imagined her confusion, her hurt, her unspoken questions. A wave of protectiveness washed over him, fierce and unwavering. He would not let this go. He would not let anyone hurt his daughter. He opened his eyes, the world suddenly sharp and clear. The doubt was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He knew what he had to do. He had to act. He had to protect Mia. The recording, the undeniable proof of Mr. Johnson's guilt, was the turning point. The quiet afternoon had shifted, the shadows lengthening, the golden light now tinged with a cold, hard edge. The game had changed, and Caleb was ready to play. The fluorescent lights of Principal Daniel's office hummed, a dull counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of Caleb's heart. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something vaguely floral, a scent that usually brought him a strange sense of calm, but today only amplified the unease churning in his gut. He sat stiffly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, the cheap material clinging unpleasantly to his jeans. He clutched the small digital recorder in his hand, its metallic coolness a stark contrast to the burning anxiety that spread through his veins. He'd replayed the recording countless times in the car, each whispered word, each muffled chew, solidifying into a cold, hard knot of anger. Mia's innocent voice, asking why her sandwich was gone, echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the betrayal he was about to expose. Principal Daniels sat behind her large, imposing desk, her expression carefully neutral. Her fingers, adorned with a single, simple silver ring, drummed a silent, restless rhythm against the polished wood. He'd met her several times before, during school events, always finding her to be a composed and approachable woman. Now, he saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, a subtle tightening of her lips that hinted at the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Mr. Adams," she began, her voice measured and calm, "thank you for coming in. I understand you have a concern regarding me as teacher, Mr. Johnson." Caleb swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He placed the recorder on the desk, its small size a stark contrast to the weight of the evidence it contained. "I do," he replied, his voice raspy. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He thought of Mia, her small hand in his, her trusting gaze. He had to do this for her. A knock echoed on the door, and a moment later, Mr. Johnson entered. Caleb's breath hitched. He recognized the man's carefully cultivated air of affability, the easy smile, the gentle demeanor. It was a facade, a carefully constructed mask concealing the petty thief beneath. The anger simmering within Caleb threatened to boil over. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. He needed to be composed, to be clear, to ensure justice for his daughter. Mr. Johnson's smile faltered as he took in the scene. His eyes, usually bright and engaging, now held a flicker of uncertainty, a hint of fear. He glanced at Caleb, then at Principal Daniels, a question forming in his eyes. Caleb wondered if the man felt even a sliver of remorse, a pang of guilt for the small, innocent child he had wronged. He doubted it. Principal Daniels gestured for Mr. Johnson to sit. He complied, perching on the edge of the chair, his usual relaxed posture replaced with a rigid stiffness. He looked like a trapped animal, Caleb thought, and a grim satisfaction settled in his stomach. Mr. Johnson, Principal Daniels addressed him, her voice still controlled, but with a discernible edge now. Mr. Adams has brought a rather serious matter to my attention. Mr. Johnson shifted uneasily in his seat. "Oh," he asked, his voice strained. "What's that?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Caleb reached out and pressed the play button on the recorder. Mia's small voice filled the room, a stark contrast to the sterile office environment. "Mr. Johnson," she could be heard saying, her voice tinged with confusion. "Where's my sandwich?" A muffled sound followed, the distinct sound of someone chewing. Then Mr. Johnson's voice, low and placating, "Oh, Mia, you must have eaten it already." Caleb watched Mr. Johnson's face as the recording played. The initial look of confusion morphed into one of stark realization, then into a sickly pallor. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the whirring of the recorder. When the recording ended, the silence in the room felt heavy, oppressive. Caleb looked at Principal Daniels, his gaze unwavering. "I want to know what you're going to do about this." The words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Principal Daniels' face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Adams, this is shocking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to Mr. Johnson, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Johnson, I need to address this immediately." Mr. Johnson finally found his voice, a stammering, desperate plea. "I was just trying to some of these kids waste food. I didn't want to go to waste." His excuse sounded as flimsy as it was pathetic. Caleb's anger flared again. "Waste food," he repeated, his voice laced with incredulity. "My daughter was hungry. You stole her lunch. You stole from a 3-year-old child." The words felt inadequate, insufficient to convey the depth of his disgust. Principal Daniels rose from her chair, her movements brisk and decisive. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice cold and hard, "I am suspending you, effective immediately. A full investigation will follow." Mr. Johnson's face crumbled. He looked from Principal Daniels to Caleb, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and despair. He opened his mouth to speak, but Principal Daniels cut him off. "Please leave, Mr. Johnson." He rose, his movements stiff and robotic, and shuffled out of the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the emptiness, the finality of the moment. Caleb felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a hollow ache. He had done what he had to do. He had protected his daughter. The silence of the house pressed in, a stark contrast to the chaotic flurry of activity that had filled it just days ago. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, the metallic tang of unease clinging to the back of his throat. The remnants of dinner sat congealing on his plate, untouched. He'd lost his appetite, a hollow ache residing where hunger should have been. It wasn't his own hunger that gnawed at him, but the echo of Mia's empty lunchbox, the phantom weight of it in his hand. He'd scrubbed it clean, sanitized it until it gleamed, yet the image of its emptiness remained, a persistent stain on his mind. He picked at a stray crumb on the table, the motion mechanical, his thoughts a swirling vortex of guilt and relief. Guilt that he hadn't noticed sooner, hadn't seen the subtle signs of Mia's dwindling energy, the quiet resignation that had settled over her usually vibrant spirit. Relief that it was over, that the insidious theft, the petty cruelty disguised as normalcy, had been exposed. The days following Mr. Johnson's suspension had been a whirlwind of hushed phone calls, whispered conversations in the schoolyard, and the unsettling realization that this violation of trust wasn't an isolated incident. Other parents had come forward, their voices trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief, echoing Caleb's own initial skepticism. He'd spoken to Mrs. Peterson, whose son, Alex, had consistently complained of stomach aches, only to confess he was hungry because his lunch disappeared. There was the shy Ms. Lee, who admitted she'd thought her daughter, Lily, was simply a picky eater, never suspecting her carefully packed bento boxes were ending up in Mr. Johnson's stomach. Each story chipped away at the carefully constructed facade of the seemingly respectable teacher, revealing a disturbing pattern of deceit. Principal Daniels had handled the situation with a grim efficiency that surprised Caleb. Her initial disbelief had quickly transformed into a steely resolve to unearth the truth. The investigation, swift and thorough, had uncovered a history of similar complaints against Mr. Johnson, whispers and rumors that had been dismissed or ignored. The weight of the evidence was undeniable: the recorded confession, the testimonies of the children, the sheer volume of uneaten lunches. Mr. Johnson was fired, his career shattered, his reputation in ruins. Caleb knew some might argue it was too harsh a punishment for stealing a few sandwiches, a couple of juice boxes. But to Caleb, it wasn't about the food. It was about the betrayal of trust, the exploitation of innocence, the calculated theft of a child's simple joy. A week turned into 2. The initial storm of outrage subsided, replaced by a fragile calm. The school implemented new lunchroom protocols. Teachers were now required to eat with the children, a symbolic gesture of shared nourishment, a silent promise to protect. Life, as it always did, began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Yet for Caleb, something had shifted. A subtle but profound change had occurred in the way he viewed the world, a heightened awareness of the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of everyday life. The click of the front door broke through his reverie. Mia burst into the kitchen, her small face alight with the boundless energy that had, thankfully, returned. The shadows seemed to recede in her presence, replaced by the warmth of her infectious laughter. "Daddy, look!" she exclaimed, holding up her lunchbox, a bright pink unicorn emblazoned on its side. He watched her, a familiar tightness constricting his chest. He saw not just his daughter, but all the other children, their innocent trust betrayed, their small stomachs left empty. He pushed the dark thoughts away, forcing a smile. "What did you have for lunch today, sweetheart?" Mia opened the lunchbox, revealing half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a few uneaten grapes, and a mostly full juice box. "Look, Daddy," she said, her voice filled with childish pride. "I didn't eat all my food today. I saved some for you." She held out the half-eaten sandwich, her small hand outstretched, an offering of unconditional love and trust. In that moment, the weight that had been pressing down on Caleb lifted. The image of the empty lunchbox faded, replaced by the vibrant colors of Mia's offering. He took the sandwich, the slightly soggy bread soft against his fingers, the sweetness of the jelly a stark contrast to the bitter taste that had lingered in his mouth for weeks. He took a bite, the simple flavors exploding on his tongue, not just the taste of peanut butter and jelly, but the taste of restored trust, the taste of a future where his daughter would never go hungry, never have her innocence violated. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite, the silence of the house no longer oppressive, but filled with the quiet hum of contentment. He looked at Mia, her bright eyes shining with an unspoken understanding, and in that shared silence, a promise was made, a silent vow to protect her, to nourish her, not just with food, but with unwavering love and a fierce determination to ensure that the shadows would never again touch her bright, untarnished spirit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room floor, painting stripes across the worn rug where Mia usually built her fantastical block towers. Caleb watched her now, quietly drawing with crayons, a picture of a brightly colored, impossibly tall tree with a swing hanging from one of its branches. He could almost feel the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him, the anxiety that had tightened its grip around his chest slowly beginning to loosen its hold. He had replayed the events countless times in his mind, each repetition a dull ache. The initial dismissal of the empty lunchbox, the nagging unease that had grown into suspicion, the chilling certainty that came with listening to the recording. The confrontation with Principal Daniels, her initial disbelief morphing into a horrified understanding. The subsequent investigation that uncovered a pattern of Mr. Johnson's transgressions, a betrayal of trust so profound it still resonated within him, a low, persistent hum of disbelief. He hadn't told Mia the full story. He'd simply said Mr. Johnson wouldn't be her teacher anymore. She'd accepted it with the easy adaptability of a child, her focus shifting quickly to a new teacher, a new classroom, a new set of crayons. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something imperceptible yet profound. He watched the way Mia carefully colored the leaves of her tree, a furrowed brow suggesting a concentration beyond her years. Had the incident, however unknowingly, left its mark on her? The thought was a splinter beneath his skin. He pushed himself off the couch, the springs groaning softly in protest, a sound he usually found irritating but today registered as a comforting familiarity. He crossed the room and knelt beside Mia, inhaling the sweet, crayon-tinged scent of her hair. He placed his hand over hers, feeling the smallness of her fingers wrapped around the crayon. "That's a beautiful tree, Mia," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. She looked up at him, her eyes, so like his own, wide and questioning. "It's for Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A knot tightened in Caleb's stomach. He'd been so focused on protecting her, on seeking justice, that he hadn't considered the complexities of a child's perspective. Mr. Johnson, despite his actions, was still someone Mia knew, someone she had interacted with daily. Did she miss him? Did she understand, on any level, the reasons behind his dismissal? The questions swirled within him, a chaotic vortex of guilt and uncertainty. "Why for Mr. Johnson?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "He liked apples," she replied, pointing to a bright red circle she had drawn hanging from a branch. "And he always said we shouldn't waste food." Caleb felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He remembered the recording, Mr. Johnson's voice, smooth and condescending, justifying his actions with the same rhetoric about food waste. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He had used the guise of responsibility to mask his own selfish desires. He had warped a valuable lesson into a justification for theft, a betrayal not only of the children's trust, but of the very principles he claimed to uphold. He forced a smile, a painful stretching of the muscles in his face. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mia." She beamed at him, her smile a ray of sunshine cutting through the shadows in his heart. He wished he could erase the past few weeks, restore her innocent trust in the world. But he knew that was impossible. The world, he realized, wasn't a brightly colored drawing. It was a place of complexities, of hidden motives, of betrayals both large and small. He spent the rest of the evening playing with Mia, building block towers that reached improbable heights, drawing fantastical creatures with mismatched body parts, losing himself in the simple joy of her laughter. But beneath the surface, the unease lingered. The incident had shaken him, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most seemingly benign individuals could harbor darkness within. As he tucked Mia into bed that night, he listened to her soft breathing, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. He thought about the other children in Mr. Johnson's class, the parents who, like him, had entrusted their precious little ones to his care. He thought about the systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He thought about the importance of vigilance, of questioning, of listening to the subtle cues children often give, cues that adults, in their busyness and assumptions, often overlook. He kissed Mia's forehead, her skin soft and warm beneath his lips. He felt a surge of protective love, a fierce determination to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, to create a safe haven where her innocence could flourish. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that true protection wasn't about shielding her from the world, but about equipping her to navigate it. It was about teaching her to trust her instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, to understand that even adults, even those in positions of authority, could make mistakes, could betray that trust. He sat by her bedside for a long time, watching her sleep, the moonlight casting a soft glow across her face. He knew the incident with Mr. Johnson was just one small chapter in the long, complex story of her life. There would be other challenges, other betrayals, other moments that would test her resilience. But he also knew that she possessed an inner strength, a quiet resilience that would carry her through. He would be there to guide her, to support her, to remind her that her voice mattered, that her feelings were valid, that her trust was precious. The people we trust with our children have an enormous responsibility, but trust should never be blind.